Hello, everyone. My name is Marija Radovanovic. I'm at Binghamton University Sociology Department. I will be talking today about an idea titled How the US Hegemony Built the Spaceship Earth, or in other words, how the global environmental consciousness originates from the US imperial project. At the end of the Second World War, the US elites were concerned about how to restore accumulation. And in the post-war world, the accumulation was going to be expanded on the planetary level because domestic resources have met their limit, or the US consumption and planned consumption and projected increase in consumption outgrew the domestic resources. But the US project of world supremacy also gave birth to something that we know as global environmental consciousness or planetary nature. And in this talk, I want to recount the material history of the US imperial project and put nature back into history, so to say, or to put it differently, the theoretical foundation for this research is the position that when nature is expelled from history, when we remove production of material life from history, we are left with a history of ideas or history of consciousness. The history of ideas, and one of those ideas is global environment, cannot tell us much about the actual material history of any period at all, including any imperial project. So this talk will try to bring nature back into history or history into nature by showing what was the material basis for the US hegemony, and then how US hegemony have necessitated the global environmental consciousness. So already at the beginning of the war, the US elites were concerned with the restoration of the accumulation, and in a series of roundtables, the roundtable discussions that The Economist magazine put together, by 1942, the US project was formulated as the American proposal. It was called the American proposal, and it was suggesting that the US will emerge as strongest single power in a post-war world. And in order to be the leading power in the world, it needs to create conditions for entire world to operate on the premises of free trade. The concern, of course, was that the global accumulation or world operating on a free trade premises will be impossible if most of Europe and Asia abolish free enterprise. So the global liberal order needed to be established in order for the US to expand accumulation to the planetary level. One of the main concerns for the US elites was the conditions of war and post-war Europe that would put people in Europe in such dire conditions that which would produce revolutionary movements. And so this making of one world was both concerned with revolutionary movements abroad, in Europe in particular, but also revolutionary movements at home. And the US had to pacify both of them. So by 1949, US adopts something called the Truman Doctrine, or the doctrine of containment, of revolutionary expansion of communism or revolutionary politics, which became challenging considering that Greece in 1947 had the communist victory, and then soon after, China was also lost to the world system. So the immediate establishing of an international liberal order was not immediately possible because of the uprising of the international proletariat. So Wallerstein suggests somewhere that one of the pillars of US hegemony was achieving internal unity, so minimizing the class conflict, making certain concessions to skilled and unionized workers, and mobilizing them in global anti-communist crusade. Through a number of agreements at home, US managed to significantly limit the power of the unions and collective bargaining. Most significant one being the Treaty of Detroit between General Motors and United Auto Workers. Of course, through a number of international institutions, the US started generating the liberal order, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and a number of other agreements through the that were achieved at the Bretton Woods Conference. One of the important immediate aspects of building the US hegemony was restoration or reconstruction of Europe. Europe was seen as directly connected to the fate of the US. So strong leftist and communist parties in Europe and post-war conditions have discouraged the US to directly fight communism in Europe. Instead, the policy was to approach it indirectly and to restore the health and economic health and vigor of European society and indirectly discourage revolutionary politics. So the Marshall Plan, so reconstruction of Europe, was one of the significant early projects of establishing European market again for the US exports. And despite some disagreements to which degree the Marshall Plan directly contributed to restoration of European economy, that by 1951, the national product per capita in Europe was about 10% above the pre-war levels. So early on during the war, the US project, the US vision was building one world, and the Roosevelt's one worldism, this idea of world having a global benevolent government and being under the dominion of the US, had found a lot of support at the time. Quincy Wright in 1942 is a political scientist from University of Chicago. Concludes in one of his studies that the war conditions are actually brought about by lack of consciousness of individuals belonging to the world community. At the same time, the UN is established symbolically in San Francisco with headquarters in New York. And Roosevelt's vision, in fact, included also bringing Soviet Union and the new liberated colonies under the new order. So peace was seen as a fundamental condition for undisrupted free trade. Another author, Wendell Willkie, also writes One World in 1942. So this idea of creating or emerging world community was quite present at the time. UNESCO was one of the earliest institutions, international institutions, that has embraced and promoted this idea of world community, stating at one of the conferences in 1947, that there is this enormous appetite for this new kind of citizenship in the world community. The sentiment that was expressed at this conference, which was called the World Community Symposium, was one of a sense of solidarity among the citizens of the world. In 1947 already, this one world community also started to take shape of conservation concerns. Julian Huxley, who was a founding director of UNESCO, stated that the question of wildlife, or principle of worldwide wildlife and national park conservation, is in a direct connection to the forging of the global or the world community. At the same time, some more mid-century Malthusian concerns start emerging, and Malthusian concerns since the time of Malthus seem to emerge every time when there is an economic crisis and time of instability, where more revolutionary forces start becoming obvious. And so the questions of overpopulation or understanding rather economic crisis and conditions as a problem of overpopulation was resumed one more time in just after the Second World War. So the interest of US in the stability and economic recovery were also somehow mirrored in these concerns regarding conservation and ecology. Some of the most prominent advocates of connection between overpopulation and resource conservation have pointed out at the time that prosperous and non-prosperous societies are interconnected in such a way that non-prosperous societies can and will, due to their dire circumstances, endanger the more prosperous societies, and sooner or later impinge on the well-being of peoples in prosperous societies. So, so the overpopulation and resource connection was now expressed as a matter of national security. And ecologically disruptive events, this is how it was formulated at the time, on one side of the planet could have detrimental effect on Americans. So in 1949, the head of US delegation to UNESCO concluded one more time that peace must be founded upon intellectual and moral solidarity of mankind. So the politics of UNESCO at the time was sort of mirroring this project of one world having liberal trade order, but through the language of knowledge and culture and peace and solidarity among individuals that are part of the world community. So of course, by 1949, the one worldism is substituted by free worldism of Truman Doctrine, because the world became bipolar. And the Truman Doctrine vision was, according to some authors, still predicated largely on Roosevelt's ideas of military, economic, and diplomatic supremacy. So US started stationing military around the world, establishing monetary system based on dollar, and starting building economic foreign aid politics and exercising its political influence through the UN. The period between 1947 and 1950 was a period of economic crisis. Europe was reluctant to join the world system under US leadership. The Soviet Union was opposing it, and the US nuclear monopoly ended. So the sentiment among the masses in the US was ambivalent, and this was a time when China also had the revolution. So that part of the Far East was lost to the world system. So the way for the US to recover from this recession was by augmenting military budget, multiplying its military bases, expanding NATO, and transforming NATO into a military alliance, substituting economic aid with military aid, and so on. So this militarization that wanted to address questions of national security, integration of Europe, and development of the third world. The US was going to be the guardian, armed guardian of the world system, and keeping Europe oriented towards American goals. So this was called the National Security Council, or NSC 68. Some massive increase in military budget required increases in tax and reduction in social welfare and civil defense in the US. And this was about the time when the US started building public opinion support for Cold War and propaganda and warfare, psychological propaganda and warfare to instigate revolts in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. By entering the Korean War, this crisis was resolved, and the US involvement in the Korean War starts 2 decades of what's called a long boom, and at the same time contestation of the Asian Pacific Rim control, because the control of the Pacific Rim for the US was a matter of rebuilding Japanese economy and making sure that Japan, by reorienting itself from China more towards Southeast Asia, has resources and raw materials access, or it can cheaply import raw materials from Southeast Asia. It wanted to keep Pacific Rim to be more extractive economies and supplying industries of the core, and to keep the region open to the capitalist economy. So, as I said, this militarization of NSC 68, military Keynesianism is called sometimes, that was implemented during the Korean War, started 2 decades of unprecedented economic growth. And it's also known as the long boom, with ambitions to integrate Germany, Asian Rimland, and Third World into the capitalist world system. At the same time, or just before the Korean War, the UN holds 2 conferences oriented towards conservation of resources. One's called UNESCO International Union for Protection of Nature Technical Conference and Scientific Conference on Conservation and Utilization of Resources. The main discussion was pertaining to the question of world resource situation. Both postulated that there is a pressure on and resource depletion and the shortage of critical supplies. So this was 1949. In 1951, Truman appoints a commission to investigate the material situation for the US, or it's called the nation's material problem, as one of the critical problems that the US is facing in the future. The commission, popularly called Paley Commission, or the President's Commission, President's Material Policy Commission, concluded that one of the conclusions was that the US has outgrown its resource base and became a raw materials deficit nation and a big importer rather than exporter. With projections about future, it seemed like the US cannot satisfy its consumption and expected growth and stimulate growth in consumption from its domestic resources. At the same time, between 1952, when the report was issued, until late 50s, a number of other world events took place that indicated that the world system, or the one world in the making, was in fact crumbling. Iran, in 1951, starts nationalizing this oil industry. Guatemala carries out agrarian reform and expropriates large masses of land that were owned by the US United Fruit Company. 1959, Bandung Conference propels China into regional leader of anti-imperial efforts, and non-aligned movement 1961 declared neutrality in the Cold War. So it seems like at this point the US had to carry out its project of one world economy without obvious imperial means in order to preclude anti-imperial revolts. As the Vietnam War is taking place, the US starts also something called a stockpiling policy, which contradicted the recommendations by the Paley Commission to get supplies or imports and access to raw materials at the lowest possible price. The US starts stockpiling and predicated on the idea that it cannot rely on large amounts of imports, considering the geopolitical situation in the world. This was 1954. By 1959, Cuba was also lost to the world system, and US started having concerns about the influence of the Soviet Union in underdeveloped countries, which would leave US starved for essential raw materials. Fast forwarding a little bit, because I have to finish soon, is by now jumping to the 1960s, and already a few years before the oil crisis, 70s oil crisis, the world economic stagnation was showing signs. And according to Wallerstein, 1968 marks the end of the 30 years unprecedented expansion of the capitalist world economy. It was also the year of massive unrest around the world. In 1968, the Club of Rome was founded by the Italian industrialist Aurelio Pezzei. The Club of Rome will commission a report that I will end this talk with, Limits to Growth, in a few years later. But before Limits to Growth, a few of studies in a similar vein were written. One was called The Only One World, and the one before that, The Spaceship Earth, by the same author, Barbara Ward, where the Spaceship Earth, at this world of global unrest, became, according to one author, it emerged out of work of international experts and civil servants, not only by establishing and sustaining, policing, and erasing boundaries separating nature from civilization, science from politics, and for my talk, most importantly, the imperial from international order. The Only One World was presented in 1972 at the UN Conference on Human Environment, and the main concern was depletion of natural resources, bringing into question Earth's ability to support human life in future. So the Spaceship Earth and Only One World sort of restored this idea of world community, and were preceded by a new surge of Malthusian concerns in late 60s, which coincides, or it doesn't only coincide, but actually emerges from the radicalization of the working class and the people of the third world around the world. So Malthusian concerns of overpopulation emerged again. And it seems like Spaceship Earth metaphor and a political project was generated at a time when it was necessary to bring in new rhetorics of uniting the world and transcending these differences, or rather relations of power produced by imperialism and inequality. So the end of this long boom by late 60s, beginning of 1970s was marked by the report I mentioned earlier, Limits to Growth, that called for the system, for establishing a system that is sustainable without collapsing suddenly and capable of satisfying basic material requirements of all its people. It suggested Limits to Growth, which was commissioned by Club of Rome and written by MIT experts in system dynamics, which first developed as a tool during the Second World War. The report suggested endless material growth cannot go on, and that humans can choose the limits, or rather than waiting for system to meet the limits. It also proposed that technological development and stabilizing human growth, shifting economic preferences towards services, education, and health, and reducing the pace, reducing resource depletion pace to let the technology and industry catch up, with some of the main recommendations of the Limits to Growth. The main concern of this report is the population growth, and because the population growth is seen by the authors as threatening the system to collapse. And the report therefore recommends redistribution of resources at subsistence level so that everybody would have at least basic necessities covered in the world. So this 1972 marks the definite end of the expansion of capitalist system and prosperity, and Limits to Growth, the report Limits to Growth, inaugurates a new era that became known as neoliberalism, which then forced the countries of the third world into something called structural adjustment programs, austerity, both domestically in the US and abroad, and has in many ways inaugurated a new era of increasing inequality and reducing social welfare provisions and public services. It is not quite clear in the ways that Limits to Growth actually directly leads to neoliberal policies. So there is not a linear connection between these two, and something that seems to me needs to be more investigated. But this is also the time when global environmental movement that was born out of this process of US hegemony, surge and decline, starts formulating environmental questions in ways that are often removed from questions of empire and particularly of the class struggle. So thank you, and I'll see you at this panel discussions.